My stepdaughter placed a document in front of me. $4,000 a month or find a nursing home. She assumed I'd sign, that a quiet, retired detective hadn't noticed 3 years of betrayal. That silence meant harmless. My grandson, a Navy SEAL, leaned close and whispered, "Grandpa, I know exactly who to call." That Friday, I made one phone call. By Monday morning, she wasn't smiling anymore. Before continuing, subscribe to our new channel, where we tell stories about men who take revenge on their insolent children, sons-in-law, and daughters-in-law. My name is Raymond Fletcher. I'm 68 years old, and I live at 1847 Palmetto Drive in Charleston, South Carolina. A two-story colonial with a wraparound porch, a live oak out front that I planted myself 31 years ago, and a workshop in the back where I restore old clocks. Spent 3 decades as a detective with the Charleston PD, most of it in the financial crimes unit. People assume retired cops sit on their porches watching the neighborhood slow down. Maybe some do. I watch differently. Old habit. Charleston in February is a particular kind of gray. The harbor fog rolls in off the Ashley River and settles over the battery like a wet blanket. Locals call it moody. I call it honest. The city looks exactly the way it feels. A little worn, a little beautiful, and completely unwilling to pretend otherwise. I've always appreciated that about this place. I've lived alone in this house for 6 years. That's a number I don't dwell on. What I do dwell on is the fact that for the last 3 of those 6 years, I have not been entirely alone. My stepdaughter Victoria and her husband Trevor moved in on a Tuesday in late autumn. "Temporary," she said, standing in my doorway with 2 suitcases and a smile that hadn't changed since she was 19. "Just until we get back on our feet. We couldn't keep up with the mortgage payments, Ray." It's embarrassing to even ask. I told her there was nothing to be embarrassed about. I told her family helps family. I was sincere when I said it. Victoria Barnes is 38 years old and works as a property manager at Carolina Home Realty, a mid-size agency downtown on East Bay Street. She is, by any observable measure, attractive and composed. She dresses well, speaks carefully, and knows exactly how to tilt her head when she wants you to feel like you've just said something wise. Her mother, my second wife Carol, had the same quality. The difference is that with Carol, it was genuine warmth. With Victoria, I eventually came to understand. It was something closer to a performance. She wasn't always this way, or maybe she was, and grief made me blind to it for years after Carol passed. I gave her every allowance a grieving man gives someone who reminds him of someone he loved. That was my first mistake, and it's one I owned completely. Trevor Barnes is 41, sells construction materials for a regional distributor, and is frequently on the road. When he's home, he occupies the couch or the back patio, from which he conducts his primary hobby, complaining about things he has no intention of fixing. He once told me with genuine seriousness that he understood contracts because he'd watched every season of a legal drama on streaming. I nodded and made a note of that, filed it away. After 30 years of interviewing people, you develop a mental filing cabinet for useful information. The first 3 months were manageable. They helped with groceries occasionally. Victoria cooked on Sundays. Trevor took out the trash maybe 4 times. I counted because counting is what I do. By the 5th month, the trash duty had quietly transferred to me, and Trevor's Jeep Grand Cherokee was occupying my spot in the driveway every single morning, which meant I parked the F-150 I'd owned for 11 years on the street like a visitor in my own home. I mentioned it once. Trevor said he'd been meaning to reorganize the driveway. That was 14 months ago. The small things accumulated the way water accumulates in a basement. Slowly, invisibly, and then all at once you realize you're standing in it. Victoria rearranged my workshop twice, each time moving my fishing gear to the back of the storage closet, on the grounds that it cluttered the aesthetic of the space. My fishing rods are a match set of Ugly Stick GX2s that I bought specifically for striped bass season on the Intracoastal. They are not decorative objects, they are tools, but I moved them back without comment because I was still in the phase where I assumed these were the ordinary frictions of shared living. Then came the evening that ended that phase permanently. It was a Wednesday around 7 in the evening. I'd come in from the back porch where I'd been working on a mantel clock. a Seth Thomas from the 1880s, with a worn mainspring that needed careful coaxing. My hands still smelled like clock oil. Victoria was in the kitchen on her phone, and I could hear her voice from the hallway, easy and unself-conscious, the way people speak when they're certain they're alone. "He doesn't pay attention," she was saying. There was amusement in her voice, the light kind, the kind that comes from being in on a joke. "He signs whatever I put in front of him without reading it. He never reads anything. Honestly, it's a laugh. Short. Relaxed? Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying." I stood in the hallway for a moment. Then I walked to my workshop, sat down at the bench, and picked up the Seth Thomas again. The mainspring tension requires patience. You release it one notch at a time. Controlled, measured, never letting it snap. I sat there for 20 minutes, working the mechanism and thinking about what I'd just heard. I did not confront her. I did not raise my voice. I did not ask what she'd meant. I had spent 30 years interviewing people who lied to my face, and the single most important thing I'd learned in that time was this: the moment you show your hand, you lose your leverage. Let people believe they're invisible. Let them keep talking. I set the mainspring, clicked the case closed, and wound the clock. It began keeping time again immediately. I found that satisfying. There's a particular kind of disrespect that operates below the threshold of anything you can easily name. It doesn't arrive as one large incident. It arrives as a pattern, 100 small decisions, each of them individually defensible, that form a shape when you step back and look at them all together. I spent about 6 months not stepping back. Then I did. The household expenses had been a shared arrangement since the second month. I covered the mortgage, utilities, and base groceries. Victoria contributed what she called a household fund, a monthly check she wrote from her account to mine, ostensibly to cover the remainder. The amount varied, somewhere between $350 and $600 depending on the month, and I hadn't examined it closely because I hadn't needed to. My pension from the city, $3,850 a month, covered the house comfortably, and I had savings in a separate account that I hadn't touched in years. I don't know exactly what made me pull the old statements that particular Tuesday afternoon. Maybe the phone call I'd overheard. Maybe a slower accumulation of details that had finally reached critical mass. Either way, I sat down at the desk in my study, the small room at the end of the upstairs hall that Victoria had twice suggested converting into a guest reading nook. And I pulled 18 months of bank records. She had been writing herself checks from the household fund account, not large ones. $600 a month, withdrawn on the 3rd of each month, transferred to a personal savings account I had no access to. 19 months. I did the arithmetic on the back of an envelope the way I used to do it at my desk in the financial crimes unit. $11,400. I remember the first time Victoria came to stay with Carol and me for a summer. She was 16, arriving from her father's place in Colombia, with a duffel bag and an expression of supreme teenage indifference. By the 3rd week, that indifference had cracked enough to show something real underneath, a sharp mind and a dry humor that surprised me. She asked me once why I kept clocks I never displayed. I told her some things worked better when nobody was watching them. She'd filed that away. I'd liked her for it. I taught her to fish that summer on the Intracoastal. She sat in the boat with her arms crossed for the first hour, then caught a 3-pound flounder, entirely by accident, and was, for approximately one afternoon, fascinated. She never came back out on the water after that. But for a while, we'd had something. That was 22 years ago. People don't transform suddenly. They drift, and you don't notice until the current has carried them somewhere you wouldn't have recognized at the start. The general power of attorney incident happened on a Sunday morning in the 10th month. Trevor came to find me in the workshop around 9, wearing the expression he deployed when he wanted something. Relaxed, man-to-man affability that I recognized as a retail version of persuasion. He had a document in his hand, folded in thirds. "Ray, registration on the F150 is due, and I've got a conference in Myrtle Beach, starting Monday. Victoria's already dealing with the closing. Could you sign this so one of us can handle the DMV run if it comes up?" He set it on my workbench. I picked it up and unfolded it. It was a general power of attorney, South Carolina, standard form. My name on the principal line, Trevor's on the agent line. It didn't authorize DMV transactions. It authorized Trevor Barnes to act on my behalf in any financial, legal, or property matter, without limitation or expiration date, unless I revoked it in writing. I folded it back along the original creases and returned to the clock. This isn't a DMV form, Trevor. It's just a general thing, easier than a specific one. Easier for whom? His face changed. The affability reconfigured into irritation. I'm just trying to help. I thought you trusted us. Victoria appeared in the doorway 17 minutes later, chin slightly lowered, voice controlled to suggest she was barely holding composure. We're trying to contribute, Ray. If you don't feel like you can trust us, maybe we should talk about whether this arrangement is working. I looked at her steadily. I'm going to have my own attorney review anything I sign going forward. Habit from the job. No offense intended. She smiled. Small, controlled. Of course, whatever makes you comfortable. That evening I sat on the back porch while the fog rolled in off the water. I thought about the phone call. I thought about $11,400. I thought about a power of attorney that would have handed every financial and legal decision in my life to two people who considered me manageable. I'm not a man who acts on anger. Anger makes you fast and sloppy, and it telegraphs your moves. What I felt wasn't anger. It was clarity. I had spent 3 years being the kind of target I would have recognized instantly in someone else. A man with a valuable asset, a fixed income, and an inclination toward generosity that certain people read as passivity. They had read me exactly that way. The mistake they'd made was assuming a quiet man was an unaware one. That because I hadn't reacted, I hadn't noticed. I went inside, sat at my desk, and thought the way I used to think before opening a case, methodically, without rushing, identifying what I knew and what I still needed. By the time I went to bed, I knew what I was going to do. Not all of it, not the details, but the shape was there, clear as the mechanism of a clock before you fit the hands. In the morning, I was going to make some calls, quietly. The South Carolina Bar Association's referral line picked up on the second ring. I'd looked up the number the previous evening, sitting at my desk with a fresh legal pad and a cup of coffee that went cold while I wrote notes. The woman on the line asked 3 questions. Area of law, county, preference for firm size. I said estate and property law, Charleston County, no preference. She gave me 4 names. I spent 20 minutes looking each one up in the State Bar's public directory. Active license, no disciplinary history, years in practice. Third on the list, Edward Quinn, Meeting Street, license since 1995. I called his office at 8 the next morning and was scheduled for Thursday at 11. Before I left, I told Victoria I had a doctor's appointment. She was in the kitchen scrolling her phone, dressed for work in the kind of blazer that signals self-importance. Routine? I said before she could ask. Nothing interesting. She returned to her phone. I picked up my keys and walked out. Quinn's office was on the 3rd floor of a narrow building on Meeting Street. Old Charleston, wide plank floors, tall windows, the settled creaking of a place that had been useful for a long time. His assistant offered me water. Quinn himself came out at exactly 11, about 55, lean, reading glasses pushed up on his head, the unhurried manner of a man who had heard most things at least twice. Firm handshake, no weather conversation. His office was organized in a way that communicated competence without advertising it. He sat across from me, opened a legal pad, and said, "Tell me the situation." No preamble. I appreciated that. I laid it out like a case summary. 2 individuals residing in my property without a formal lease for 34 months. Unauthorized financial transfers totaling $11,400 from a joint household account. An attempt to obtain a general power of attorney through misrepresentation of its purpose. A house assessed at $412,000. Owned outright. Quinn listened without interrupting. What are you looking to accomplish? Protection of the asset, documentation of the financial misconduct, a legal basis for removal. He nodded. The tool you want is a revocable living trust. The property and liquid assets transfer into the trust, no longer titled in your personal name, significantly harder to attack through a competency claim. He explained the structure. I remained grantor and initial trustee, retained full control during my lifetime, could amend or revoke at any point. But the property would be off a personal probate search, and any challenge to my capacity would require a formal court proceeding with a high evidentiary bar. "Who would you name as beneficiary?" he asked. "My grandson. 24, stationed at Camp Lejeune. The son of my son, who died when Cody was 11. There was no one else." "Cody Fletcher," I said. "Documents drafted within 10 days. Filing with Charleston County Register of Deeds. 2 to 3 days after that. Full package including property transfer and account retitling. $4,200. I wrote him a check before I left. 2 days later, I was in North Charleston, in a low building on a commercial strip between an auto parts store and a tax service. The door said Perry Investigative Services. I'd found the listing through an online search, verified the state PI license, and read through the reviews. Louise Perry was about 45, short dark hair, the practiced stillness of someone accustomed to watching without being noticed. 12 years in insurance investigations before going independent. Desk covered in folders, whiteboard on the wall, no motivational quotes anywhere. Good signs, both. I explained what I needed: documentation of the transfer pattern, analysis of the bank records, and a search for any business registrations tied to Victoria Barnes at my address. I handed her a folder with the highlighted bank statements. She looked through it steadily. 19 months, 600 each, third of the month. Correct? Joint account. You funded it. She was cosigner. For household bill payments. I paused. I should have closed it the first month. You trusted someone. That's not a character flaw. She set the folder down. $95 an hour, 800 minimum retainer. If the registration search turns up anything significant, I'll call before proceeding. I left with a receipt for $800 and drove back across the bridge. The house was quiet. Trevor was in Wilmington on a sales run. I went to my workshop and picked up the Waltham pocket watch I'd been working on. 1903, cracked crystal, balance wheel running 5 minutes fast. The replacement crystal had arrived from Connecticut the day before. I seated it, checked the wheel. Running even. Victoria appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, still in her work clothes, glass of water, doing the casual scan of the room she'd started performing lately. Eyes moving across shelves and benches with the specific attention of someone taking inventory. "Where were you this morning?" Conversational. "Doctor's appointment. Routine." "You were gone a long time." "Traffic on the crosstown." She held my gaze a beat too long, then smiled. Small, controlled. "I'm making pasta tonight, if you want some." "I'll figure something out." She left. I listened to her footsteps recede. She didn't believe me. I could read it in the pause, that fraction of a second recalibration. Something had shifted in the past few days, and she couldn't name it yet. That was fine. She'd spent years reading my surfaces and concluding I was manageable. She'd never needed to look any deeper than that. A week passed, then another. I'd become a careful observer of the house in a way I hadn't been before. Not paranoia, but the trained attention of a man who has reopened a case file and is reading it with fresh eyes. Details I'd dismissed as minor frictions over 3 years began to form a coherent picture. Victoria checked my mail first. I'd noticed it twice before and attributed it to carelessness. She'd grab the stack from the box, sort it on the kitchen counter, leave my envelopes already opened with a post-it reading yours. I started thinking about what she'd read over 19 months. Bank statements, insurance documents, the annual property tax notice listing the assessed value of 1,847 Palmetto Drive, $412,000. For a woman who dealt in property transactions every working day, that number wasn't abstract. It was an inventory item. Trevor had begun asking questions about the house, framed as small talk, spaced across different conversations. HVAC age, roof condition, foundation history. He delivered each one with the casual confidence of a man who believes he's being subtle. He was not. Someone was compiling a property condition summary, and that someone had a clear use for it. Louise Perry called 9 days after our first meeting. "Initial report is ready. Can you come in today?" I was at her office by 11. The bank transfer records were laid out first. 19 months, 600 each. totaling $11,400, transferred to a savings account in Victoria Barnes's name at a separate institution. Transfer dates highlighted. Then she turned to the second section. VB Property Consulting, LLC, she said. Registered with the South Carolina Secretary of State 8 months ago. Registered agent, Victoria Barnes. Registered address. She turned the page toward me. 1847 Palmetto Drive, Charleston, South Carolina. My home address, used as the legal registration address for a private LLC I had never been told about and had not consented to. It created a paper trail connecting her business operations directly to my property. Business activity, property consulting and acquisition advisory. She's already a licensed property manager at a real estate firm. This LLC is a separate vehicle for private transactions, the kind that wouldn't go through an employer's books. Off-market transfers, a seller whose capacity might be questioned. The structure had a specific and familiar shape. One more item. She turned to a third section. VBP Holdings, LLC, registered 4 months ago. Same registered agent, different address. A UPS store on Rivers Avenue. 2 LLCs, the first at my address, the second at a private mailbox. Newer, and specifically structured to break the paper connection to my property. 4 more hours to trace VBP Holdings membership structure. $380 against your retainer. You have $420 remaining. Do it. I drove straight from Perry's office to Meeting Street. Quinn listened to the LLC summary without interrupting. This is a known pattern in elder financial exploitation cases. The LLC at the property address can be used to argue a business interest in the property, typically paired with a claim that the resident lacked capacity. Countermeasure. 2 things simultaneously. First, we accelerate the trust. Documents ready Friday. Once the property retitles into the trust, your personal ownership no longer exists. Any claim built on that foundation collapses. He picked up his pen. Second, close the joint account today. Transfer the balance to a new individual account at a different institution. Current balance? $14,230. Move it before end of business. He set the pen down. Raymond, this isn't opportunistic. The transfers started 19 months ago. The LLC registered 8 months ago. The transfers were a test. They wanted to see if you'd react. When you didn't, the structure escalated. 19 months. Not patience as strategy, patience as blindness. I confirmed Friday, thanked Quinn, and drove home. Victoria was on the back porch when I came in. I went straight to my study, opened the banking portal, and transferred $14,230 to my individual account at a separate institution. Full amount, same business day. Then I closed the laptop. There's a point in any investigation when the preliminary work ends and the active phase begins. You've built what you need. You've identified the shape of the problem. What remains is execution, measured without excess. I wasn't there yet, but I could see it. Friday, Quinn would have the trust documents ready. The house, $412,000, and the savings account, $88,000, would retitle into the Raymond Fletcher Revocable Living Trust, Cody as sole beneficiary. After that, 1847 Palmetto Drive would no longer exist as they'd been counting on it. Everything they'd built their plan on would be standing on air. I heard the back door, Victoria's footsteps in the kitchen, then a pause, the brief silence of someone noticing something slightly off. The mail on the counter wasn't there. I'd started collecting it myself, from the box, 3 days ago. She came to the study doorway. "Trevor's back tomorrow," she said. "Good for Trevor," I said. She studied me. That pause again, longer now. Something in my tone wasn't matching the Raymond she'd catalogued. "You seem different lately." I looked up from my desk. "I'm the same as I've always been, Victoria." She held my gaze, then nodded and went back down the hall. On my desk, beside the Waltham pocket watch, keeping exact time now, not a second off, sat a yellow legal pad with one line written at the top. Friday, 11 a.m. Quinn's office. Below it, a second line I'd added that afternoon. Bring the check. The trust was recorded with Charleston County Register of Deeds 10 days after I signed the documents in Quinn's office. He called to confirm on a Thursday morning. I was in the workshop when the phone rang. The Waltham was on the bench, fully restored now, running without a flaw. I set it down and picked up. "Everything is filed and recorded," Quinn said. "The Raymond Fletcher Revocable Living Trust is on record as the titled owner of 1847 Palmetto Drive as of this morning. Your savings account retitling with the bank should process by end of week. And if someone pulls a public property search on my name, they'll find nothing in your personal name. The trust is its own legal entity." A pause. "I'd recommend you don't tell anyone about this for the time being." "I wasn't planning to," I said. I hung up and sat for a moment in the quiet of the workshop. Outside, Victoria's car was in the driveway. She'd taken a half-day from Carolina Home Realty. I'd heard her on the phone earlier, rescheduling a showing. Trevor's Jeep was back from wherever it had been for the past 4 days. The house had a particular stillness to it, the kind that comes before a conversation someone has been rehearsing. I recognized it. I'd walked into that kind of room many times over 30 years. They were waiting in the dining room. That detail was deliberate. Not the kitchen, where we had ordinary conversations, but the dining room, which we almost never used. The table had been cleared and the overhead light was on, which made everything look more formal than it was. Victoria was seated at the far end with a manila folder in front of her. Trevor stood near the window with his arms crossed, affecting the posture of a man who was backing up someone else's play while maintaining the option to claim he wasn't involved. I came in, pulled out a chair, and sat down. Victoria placed a document on the table and pushed it toward me. It was a printed form, 8 pages, bound with a binder clip. The header read, "Cohabitation and Care Agreement, 1847 Palmetto Drive, Charleston, South Carolina." "We've been thinking about the arrangement," she said. Her voice was measured, rehearsed, but not obviously so. She had practiced it enough times to smooth most of the edges. "It's been 3 years, Ray. We contribute to this household. We help with maintenance, with errands. We've been here for you." She paused, letting that settle. "We think it's fair to formalize things." I picked up the document and began reading it. The first 2 pages were preamble. Language about shared living arrangements, mutual responsibilities, the nature of the cohabitation. Standard sounding. The kind of language designed to read reasonably to someone who wasn't reading carefully. I read carefully. Page 3 was where it changed. Section 4, subsection B. In consideration of ongoing residential accommodation, care services, and household management provided by Victoria Barnes and Trevor Barnes, Raymond Fletcher agrees to a monthly contribution of $4,000, payable on the 1st of each month, designated for household maintenance, care coordination, and operational expenses. I kept reading. Section 6. In the event Raymond Fletcher is unable or unwilling to meet the monthly contribution described in Section 4, B, the parties agree that Raymond Fletcher will voluntarily transition to an appropriate elder care facility, including but not limited to facilities located on Highway 17, Charleston County, at a timeline to be mutually determined, but not to exceed 60 days, $4,000 a month. Or I leave my own house within 60 days and move to a care facility on Highway 17. My pension was $3,850 a month. I read through to the end. The signature block had 3 lines, one for Victoria, one for Trevor, one for me, with a notary acknowledgement section that had already been prepared, with a notary stamp from a service on King Street. They'd had this notarized in advance of showing it to me. The confidence in that detail was almost impressive. I set the document down on the table, folded my hands, looked at the wall for a moment, then at Victoria, then at the document. I picked it up again and folded it along the center crease, the way you fold a letter before returning it to an envelope. Then I set it back on the table. Trevor uncrossed his arms. "Ray, we're not trying to make this difficult. We just think." Something moved in the hallway. I looked up. Cody was standing in the doorway. He was in civilian clothes, jeans, a gray pullover, with a duffel bag still on his shoulder, like he'd walked in from the car 30 seconds ago and hadn't had time to put it down. He was 24 years old, 6 feet even, and he had the kind of stillness that doesn't come from calm temperament, but from training. the specific, deliberate stillness of a man who has learned to read a room before he does anything else in it. He read this one in about 4 seconds. His eyes moved from the document on the table, to Victoria's face, to Trevor's posture, to mine. He set the duffel bag down quietly in the hallway and walked into the dining room. He came to stand beside my chair. He bent down slightly and said, in a voice just above a whisper, "Grandpa, I know exactly who to call." I looked at him for a moment, then I looked at Victoria. She was watching Cody with an expression that had shifted. The practiced composure slightly disrupted, a new calculation running behind her eyes. She hadn't accounted for him. That was the first unscripted moment of the evening. I looked at her for a long moment, and then, for the first time in longer than I could recall sitting at that table, I smiled. Cody stayed the weekend. He slept in the spare room, said almost nothing to Victoria or Trevor. Not rudely, just with the efficient economy of someone who doesn't spend words where they aren't needed. He helped me with a section of porch railing I'd been meaning to fix for months, and in the evenings we sat on the back steps in the way we always had. Short sentences, long silences. He didn't ask about my plan. He knew I had one. Saturday evening, Victoria appeared in the kitchen doorway and asked, with careful lightness, whether I'd had a chance to think about the agreement. I told her I was still reviewing it. She nodded and went back down the hall. I heard her and Trevor murmuring behind their door for about 40 minutes. Sunday morning, Cody loaded his duffel into his truck and shook my hand. "Call me when it's done." "I will," I said. He drove back to Camp Lejeune. I watched until the truck turned the corner, then went inside and picked up the phone. It was a Friday evening when I made the call. 6:45. I was in my study. Door closed. Quinn picked up on the second ring. "It's Raymond Fletcher." "I expected to hear from you." He was home. I could hear a television somewhere behind him. "The agreement they presented. Did you keep a copy?" "Photographed every page. Send those tonight. I take it you're ready to move." "That's why I'm calling." The television sound cut off. "Here's what happens next. I'll prepare a demand letter under South Carolina tenancy law. They're tenants at will, no written lease, 30 days written notice to vacate. The letter will also demand repayment of $11,400 in unauthorized transfers, documented by Louise Perry's report. Sent by certified mail and process server simultaneously on Monday morning. And the LLC? Simultaneously, a notice to the HR department at Carolina Home Realty, a business entity registered to a residential address belonging to another party, without that party's consent, is a compliance matter for a licensed real estate agency. Their HR director will make of it what they make of it." I sat with that for a moment. "One more thing," Quinn said. "The cohabitation agreement they showed you is not enforceable under South Carolina law, but the fact that they prepared and presented it, combined with the transfer documentation and the LLC registration, strengthens the picture of a coordinated pattern. Louise Perry should have a copy. It adds to the file." "I'll call her Monday," I said. "Good. Raymond, the trust is solid. The transfers are documented. You've done everything correctly. This is the part where it gets uncomfortable for them." I thanked him and hung up. I sat in my study after the call. The house was quiet. Down the hall, a light was on under the door to Victoria and Trevor's room. At some point, they'd ordered food. I'd heard the doorbell, the sound of containers in the kitchen. A normal Friday evening from people who believed the next phase of their plan was simply waiting for me to sign. They'd be getting 2 certified letters on Monday morning. One here at 9 a.m., hand-delivered by a process server. One at Carolina Home Realty on East Bay Street, arriving in the Morning Post. I allowed myself briefly the satisfaction of a man who has measured everything correctly and is watching the mechanism engage. Monday came with flat gray skies and a cold wind off the harbor. I made coffee at 6, read on the porch, and was back inside by 8:30. At 9:04, the doorbell rang. I didn't go to answer it. Trevor's footsteps crossed toward the door, and I heard the brief exchange of a man receiving a document he wasn't expecting. The door closed. 10 seconds of silence. Then Victoria's voice, stripped of its careful management. "What is this?" I walked to the kitchen doorway. Trevor was holding the pages, already open. his face the specific colorlessness of a man whose plan has just encountered a wall it didn't know was there. Victoria had taken the pages and was reading, her composure operating under pressure it wasn't designed for, like a well-made lock meeting the right key. She looked up and found me in the doorway. "This is from your attorney," she said, controlled, but with audible effort behind it now. "Appears so," I said. "You're telling us to leave." "The letter does the telling. I just made the call." Trevor set the pages on the side table and looked at me, the expression of a man scanning for leverage, looking for the angle back to solid ground. "Ray, this is not how family handles things." "We can discuss how family handles things," I said, "after you've read the second paragraph." He found it. His jaw tightened. $11,400. Documented, bank records attached. Victoria's phone buzzed on the hall table. She glanced at the screen. Something crossed her face. A new calculation, sudden and unwelcome. Carolina Home Realty. She picked it up and walked quickly down the hall, closing the door behind her, her voice behind it, low, urgent, for about 90 seconds, then silence. Trevor stood in the hallway with the pages in his hand, looking at nothing. His face had gone past colorlessness into the slow recognition that the game had changed shape entirely. I said nothing. I took my coffee back to the study and picked up the Waltham, still keeping perfect time. Victoria moved fast, I'll give her that. Within 4 days of receiving the demand letter, she and Trevor had retained an attorney, a man named Russell Moore, whose office was on Broad Street, 2 blocks from the courthouse. Quinn knew of him. When I mentioned the name on our next call, there was a brief pause on his end that communicated more than words would have. "He's not incompetent," Quinn said. "He works elder law cases from the other side. What that means is he knows the playbook, which is capacity challenge. He'll file a petition arguing that you lack the mental capacity to execute the trust documents. The argument will be that an elderly man living under stress, isolated from family support, was manipulated into signing legal instruments he didn't understand." A pause. "It's a standard approach. I want you to hear it from me now, so it doesn't surprise you when the filing arrives." It arrived 6 days later. A petition filed with Charleston County Probate Court, captioned, "In the matter of Raymond Fletcher," requesting a judicial determination of financial incapacity and seeking to void the revocable living trust. Victoria and Trevor were listed as petitioning parties. I read the filing at my desk and noted, not without some appreciation, how carefully it was constructed. It described me as a 68-year-old widower living in social isolation, exhibiting signs of cognitive decline, having executed complex legal documents without independent legal counsel present. That last point technically imprecise, since Quinn had been present at the signing, but Moore was counting on the petition language landing before anyone checked the details. I called Quinn and read him the relevant paragraphs. He said. "The independent counsel point is easy. I was there. Claire notarized it. We have a signed acknowledgement. The capacity claim requires a response." He was already thinking ahead. "We need an independent neuropsychological evaluation, not our choice of examiner. We want the court's own recommended evaluator, or someone from MUSC. If we choose the examiner ourselves, Moore will challenge the objectivity." 2 weeks later, I drove to the Medical University of South Carolina on Jonathan Lucas Street and spent 90 minutes with a Dr. Anita Forsyth. Memory sequences, pattern recognition, verbal fluency, executive function tasks. The standard battery for cognitive impairment assessment. Afterward, she said the results would go to the court within 10 business days. "Any preliminary observations?" I asked. 93rd percentile for executive function in your age group," she said. "The rest is in the report." I drove home along the waterfront and stopped at the end of Palmetto Drive to check the mailbox before pulling in. A letter from Carolina Home Realty was in the stack, addressed to Victoria, which I set on the hall table without opening. The return address told me enough. Their HR department had not been idle. Louise Perry called that same afternoon. "I've added the cohabitation agreement to the file. I'd like to discuss the video surveillance records." "What video records?" "The motion-activated exterior camera I installed on the northwest corner 3 weeks ago. You approved it on March 3rd. I had. She'd mentioned needing to document property condition and unusual activity. The camera was mounted near the roofline, angled to cover the driveway and the detached garage where I kept the F-150, and against the back wall, furniture I'd moved into storage when Victoria decided the dining room needed refreshing. "What does the footage show?" I asked. 19 days of routine activity, Perry said. And then 4 days ago, Trevor Barnes loading items from the garage into his Jeep Grand Cherokee. The footage is time-stamped and clear. Another pause, including the antique secretary desk from the back wall, the one with the brass hardware. I sat very still for a moment. The secretary desk was a 19th century piece, walnut, original hardware, purchased at an estate auction in Savannah 15 years ago. A dealer I'd consulted once, purely out of curiosity, had estimated its value at $8,400. Trevor had loaded it into his Jeep on a Tuesday afternoon while I was at my appointment at MUSC. "Send me the footage," I said. I called Quinn and then called the Charleston Police Department's non-emergency line. A patrol officer came to the house within the hour, took my statement, reviewed Perry's time-stamped footage on my laptop, and filed a report. Theft of personal property valued at $8,400, a felony threshold in South Carolina. The officer asked where Mr. Barnes was currently. Trevor's Jeep was in the driveway. He had apparently not yet moved the desk from his vehicle. The officer asked if he could speak with Mr. Barnes. What followed was not something I witnessed directly. I stayed in my study, but I heard it with reasonable clarity through the walls. Trevor's voice, initially the affable man-to-man register he used when he wanted something. Then a shift, as the officer explained the nature of the report. Then something that sounded less like conversation and more like a man running rapidly through his available responses and finding none of them adequate. Trevor spent 4 hours at the Charleston Police Department's headquarters on Lockwood Drive. The secretary desk was returned to the garage before the Jeep left the property. When Trevor came home, he walked past the study without speaking. His face had the tight, compressed quality of a man holding a great deal of something and not allowing any of it to show. I found that more informative than whatever he might have said. Quinn called on a Thursday morning, and I could tell from the first 2 words, "Raymond, listen," that something had landed. "Moore filed a supplemental motion," he said. He found a defect in the trust documentation. Exhibit C, the schedule of assets attached to the trust, the addendum listing the savings account. The second page is missing the notary acknowledgement block. The notary signed page 1. Page 2 was not separately acknowledged. I sat down. "Is the defect real?" "It's real." Quinn's voice stayed level. "It's a technical error. Claire, my notary, was working from a template, and the second page of that particular addendum didn't carry the acknowledgement block forward. It should have. I take responsibility for not catching it in review." "What does Moore do with it?" "He's filed a motion to void the trust in its entirety on the basis of defective execution. Under South Carolina law, a trust instrument with a notarization error can be challenged." A pause. "But there's a remedy. South Carolina Code Section 62-2-202 provides for reformation of trust. A court can correct a scrivener's error in a trust document without voiding the entire instrument, provided the original intent is clear and the error is demonstrably clerical rather than substantive." "How long?" "I filed a reformation petition today. Hearing before a probate judge. Standard calendar. 12 to 14 business days. In the meantime, the trust remains provisionally operative. Moore's motion doesn't void it automatically. It requires a court order, which won't come before the reformation hearing. 12 to 14 business days. 2.5 weeks during which the trust was in procedural limbo. "File it today," I said. "It's already drafted," Quinn said. The next 2 weeks moved at the particular speed of legal proceedings, which is to say, slowly, in calendar terms, and very quickly in terms of what was happening around them. Victoria came home 3 days after the reformation petition was filed, and told me, with a composure that had recovered something of its original quality, that she and Trevor were consulting with Moore about their options. The capacity evaluation results had come back from MUSC and had been submitted to the probate court. Full cognitive norm for my age group, 93rd percentile executive function. Moore had received a copy. The capacity petition was, Quinn told me quietly, effectively finished. Moore would let it sit on the docket without pursuing it further, rather than formally withdraw it. That was how attorneys managed graceful exits from losing positions. What Moore had left was the notarization defect, and he was pushing it. Victoria knew about the defect. I could tell because she stopped asking about the demand letter's 30-day deadline and started asking with careful casualness whether I'd heard anything from my lawyer lately. The question was an antenna. She was checking whether I knew what Moore had found. I told her I heard from my attorney regularly. She nodded and went back to her phone. Trevor, meanwhile, had become quieter than I'd ever seen him. The golf games had stopped. He spent time on the back porch on his phone, speaking in low tones, or sitting in their room with the door closed. The Jeep made fewer appearances in the driveway. 3 days after the failed secretary desk incident, a credit card statement arrived in the joint mail. Not mine, his, from a bank that shared the household address. And I saw, before I set it on the table, that it showed a balance of $14,600 against a credit limit of $15,000. He'd maxed it out, recently and quickly. Legal fees, most likely. Cody called on a Wednesday evening. He'd heard about the MUSC results from me the week before, and now he asked simply, "How's the paper problem?" 12 days, I said. Quinn files the Reformation petition Thursday, hearing in 2 weeks. Do you need me there? I thought about it. Not yet. But keep the weekend open. A brief silence. Done, he said. 3 days before the Reformation hearing, Perry called with the information I'd been waiting for. Victoria left yesterday morning, she said. Solo. Her car was gone by 7 a.m. and returned at 9:45 p.m. I tracked the license plate through toll records on I-26. A pause. She drove to Columbia. Columbia was 115 miles northwest up the interstate. It was the state capital. It was also, as I happen to know from 30 years of working property crime cases, where several notary services operated that had appeared in previous fraud investigations involving quitclaim deeds. I need you to find out who she met, I said. Already working on it, Perry said. Give me 48 hours. I hung up and sat for a long moment in the workshop. The Waltham was on the shelf above the bench, keeping time in the quiet. Outside, the February light was going flat against the live oak. She'd driven to Columbia while the trust was in limbo and the demand letter's deadline was still technically running. She hadn't given up. She'd pivoted. And that told me something important. Whatever she was planning in Columbia, she believed she still had a path, which meant I needed to know what that path was before she had time to walk it. Perry called 46 hours after Victoria's return. His name is David Wren, she said. Notary Public, licensed in South Carolina, office on Gervais Street in Columbia. Cited twice by the Secretary of State's Office for Procedural Irregularities, both involving real property instruments. No formal sanctions, but the record is there. What did she meet him about? I can't tell you the content of the meeting, but I can tell you what Wren does as a specialty. He handles out-of-county notarizations for real property transfers. Specifically, he's been used in several transactions where the property owner was listed as elderly, and the deed transferring title was a quitclaim. A pause. A quitclaim deed is the simplest instrument for transferring property. It requires only a signature and a notarization. If a person signs one under duress, or if the signature is obtained fraudulently, the property transfers, I said, immediately and completely. No title search required, no attorney involvement. It records in the county where the property sits, which would be Charleston County. I sat with that for a moment. Victoria had driven to Columbia, 115 miles, during the window when the trust was in procedural limbo, to meet with a notary who specialized in quitclaim deeds involving elderly property owners. She had been preparing a document that would transfer 1,847 Palmetto Drive out of my name, or she believed, still in my name, and into hers. The trust filing had closed that door. She didn't know it yet. How complete is your documentation on the Wren meeting? I asked. Toll records, time-stamped exterior footage of her car in the lot adjacent to his office building, and a public record search that shows Wren incorporated a second LLC 4 weeks ago. VB Property Consulting, LLC is listed as a member entity. Perry's voice stayed even. The LLC at your address. She was already working with him. Send everything to Quinn tonight, I said, and put together a complete package. Every document, every record, every transfer log. I'm going to need to make another call. To whom? The Attorney General's office. The South Carolina Attorney General's Consumer Protection and Elder Fraud Division operates out of an office on Main Street in Columbia. Quinn had the direct contact. 2 days after Perry's package arrived, Quinn and I were on a conference call with a senior investigator named Patricia Holloway. She listened without interrupting while Quinn walked through the documentation. The LLC at my address, the unauthorized transfers totaling $11,400, the cohabitation agreement with its $4,000 demand, the capacity petition, the secretary desk, and the meeting with David Wren. When Quinn finished, Holloway was quiet for a moment. The Wren connection is what moves this from civil to criminal territory, she said. If we can establish that a quitclaim deed was being prepared for fraudulent execution against a property owner, particularly one who is elderly, that's a violation of South Carolina. Code Section 16-13-240. Real estate fraud. Up to 5 years? What do you need from us? Quinn asked. Everything Perry compiled, plus a signed statement from Mr. Fletcher. We'll open a preliminary inquiry. If Wren cooperates, and he typically will when the alternative is a felony charge on a second offense, we'll have the full picture quickly. I gave a signed statement the following afternoon. Wren cooperated within the week. His attorney negotiated a proffer agreement, full disclosure in exchange for a reduced charge. What he disclosed was precise. Victoria had engaged him 6 months prior. The quitclaim deed had been drafted and was ready for execution. It needed only my signature, which she planned to obtain through the cohabitation agreement's pressure mechanism, or, if that failed, through the capacity petition. The deed would then have been recorded in Charleston County, transferring title to VBP Holdings LLC, the second entity at the UPS store address, before any challenge could be filed. The trust had closed every part of that path. She hadn't known about the trust when she drove to Columbia. She had been preparing a document to transfer an asset I no longer personally owned. The investigative notice arrived at 1847 Palmetto Drive on a Thursday morning, addressed to Victoria from the Attorney General's office, identifying her as a subject of a preliminary inquiry under SC Code, Section 16-13-240. I was in the kitchen when she opened it, the sound of the envelope, then silence, the particular silence of a person whose calculations have just collapsed. Then her footsteps, quick and uneven toward the bedroom. The door closed, her voice low and urgent on the phone. 40 minutes later, Trevor came into the kitchen. He looked like a man who had been awake too long. His face had the compressed quality I had seen after the police visit, but worse. "Victoria got a letter," he said. "I know," I said. He stood for a moment, then sat down at the kitchen table. It was the first time in 3 years I had seen Trevor Barnes sit at that table and have nothing to say. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "That's a question for your attorney," I said. "Or hers." He nodded. Whatever he'd hoped to find in my answer, he hadn't found it. Later that week, Carolina Home Realty sent a registered letter to the house. I left it on the hall table for Victoria. I didn't need to read it. The return address was sufficient. Her employment had been terminated for conflict of interest. 3 days after that, Trevor loaded his Jeep with what I counted as 11 bags and boxes. He came to the study doorway and said, in a voice that had lost most of its familiar register, "I'm going to stay at my parents' place in Columbia for a while." "Safe drive," I said. He left without another word. The day Victoria left, it rained. A slow, steady Charleston rain, the kind that settles in off the harbor and doesn't hurry. I was in the workshop when I heard her car in the driveway. 2 trips, which meant she was taking what she could fit without making arrangements for the rest. The second time she came through the front door, her heels were wet and her face was doing something I hadn't seen from her before. Not the composed mask, not the wounded sincerity. Something stripped back to the structure underneath, without the performance over it. She stopped in the hallway. I was standing near the kitchen doorway. She looked at me for a long moment. Her posture was different from every other time I had seen her in that hallway. The careful erectness, the management of impression was gone. She stood the way people stand when they are very tired and have stopped trying to look otherwise. She didn't say anything. She looked at me, and then she looked at the wall, and then she walked out the front door. I heard her car back out of the driveway. The sound of it moved down Palmetto Drive and faded into the rain. I stood in the hallway for a moment, then went to the kitchen and put water on for coffee. The house on Palmetto Drive had been occupied continuously for 3 years by people who treated it as a resource to be extracted. Without them in it, it was quiet in a way I'd almost forgotten. Not empty, but still, the particular stillness of a place that belongs to itself again. I opened the windows in the study. Outside, the live oak I'd planted 31 years ago moved slowly in the wet air. Quinn called that afternoon to confirm the status of the various proceedings. The trust was confirmed valid and operative by the probate court's reformation order, issued 12 days after filing. The property and the savings account, $88,000, were titled In the Trust, with Cody as sole beneficiary. Moore's capacity petition had been withdrawn the previous week, quietly, without formal notice. The civil claim stood at $11,400 in principal, plus $4,200 in legal costs, $15,600 total. Victoria had been served. The Attorney General's inquiry into the quitclaim deed matter had been elevated to a formal investigation under SC Code, Section 16-13-240, with charges pending. Victoria had retained a criminal defense attorney within 48 hours of the investigative notice. Carolina Home Realty had separately filed a civil claim against Victoria for unauthorized use of a licensed agency's address for private business registration. Is there anything else you need from me right now? Quinn asked. Not today, I said. A brief pause, the briefest I'd heard from him. You handled this correctly, Raymond, at every step. I had good counsel, I said. He made a sound that from Quinn was the equivalent of a modest smile, and hung up. Cody arrived that evening. He'd driven up from Camp Lejeune after his shift, 4 hours on I-40 and I-26. I heard his truck in the driveway and went to the porch. He looked at the house before he came up the steps, the way he looked at things he was assessing, then at me. Done? He asked. Mostly. The criminal matter is still open. The civil claim is filed. The rest is waiting for courts. He nodded. But the house is clear. The house is clear. He sat down on the porch steps, and I sat beside him. The rain had stopped. The air smelled the way Charleston air smells after an evening rain in summer. Salt and wet brick, and the particular warmth of the low country at dusk. Down the street, a neighbor's porch light came on. I had the Waltham in my hand, the pocket watch I'd been restoring when all of this began. Fully repaired now, keeping time without a flaw. I turned it over in my fingers the way I always did when I was thinking. Cody glanced at it, then looked back at the street. She really thought you'd signed the $4,000 agreement, he said. She thought she understood the person she was dealing with. She was wrong about that. She was wrong about a number of things. I looked at the watch for a moment. She thought a quiet man was a harmless one. That patience meant I wasn't paying attention. That because I didn't react, I hadn't noticed. I paused. People make that assumption about a certain kind of person. It's a reasonable assumption most of the time. Cody was quiet. The thing about 30 years working financial crimes, I said, is that you spend most of it reading documents and watching people lie. You get very good at both, and you learn something important. The person who stays calm in the room almost always has more information than the person who's performing. She was always performing. From the first day she walked in the door with those 2 suitcases. I set the watch down on my knee. The harbor light was fading out over the rooftops to the east. She forgot that I'd spent 3 decades watching people walk into rooms exactly the way she walked into mine, sizing up the space, deciding what they could take. I looked at the live oak at the end of the front walk. The rain had darkened its bark, and the branches moved in the last of the evening breeze. 30 years I read up people like that, I said quietly. She just forgot that I could write too. Cody nodded once, the way he did when something was settled. We sat on the porch of 1847 Palmetto Drive, while the sky went dark over Charleston, and the Waltham kept perfect time in my hand, and the house behind us was quiet and mine. If you like this story, subscribe to our new channel and listen to a few stories there. You can find the link to it in the collaboration or description of this video, or in the comments. Subscribe so you don't lose us, because this channel may soon cease to exist.